Good afternoon. Welcome to my second attempt at a Zoom broadcast, so we'll see how it works out. But I'm basically inspired today by a posting on Facebook from Katie Zimmerman about essentially the opportunities that are presented to us right here and right now. It kind of syncs with a lot of my own feelings about the situation we find ourselves in, perhaps trying to find something really positive about it, but also recognizing that this is a really pivotal point. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I'm going to go to her statement, which I put on the news page, the front page of our course, and then also included a response that I gave to it, just sort of very general, hopefully thought-provoking, trying to get us to take the idea seriously and not just, pie in the sky kind of ideas. And then encouraging your response. And then because it's such a great topic, I'm pulling together the economic development planning with the transportation planning to try to present it as a unit and talk about nonlinear planning, essentially trying to break it out. The textbook has all these chapters broken into individual bits. The secret is being able to pull things together and having a plan that does many things. So if you'll forgive me while I go around here, I'm going to try to get to a full screen to show you the wording, and then we'll take it from there. So let's see. Hello. Yeah, here we go. So here we are. This is our course. This is Katie Zimmerman speaking just, I think it was last night. To build resilience, the trick is linking different goals together. When you're doing economic development, how can you also make yourself better protected for floods? When thinking about mobility, how can you increase biodiversity or reduce exposure to extreme heat? When thinking about governance and community engagement, how do you build trust and confidence in elected officials so that in crisis situations, people listen to and follow the advice of elected leaders? A bunch of good questions there, right? In the US, there is probably going to be a job stimulus, and that will likely come with a lot of new infrastructure that we build. That gives us incredible opportunity to build more resilient infrastructure and to engage communities as we do it, since they're going to live with it for generations. We should also talk about climate change mitigation and adaptation, because if we're potentially going to get a whole new generation of infrastructure because of this pandemic, then we have to do it better than the last generation, meaning like no highways that segregate communities from economic centers. We should also set new goals. We have the tools to think about economic development, public health, biodiversity, and flood control all at once. We have the beginnings of examples of what those types of projects look like, such as building a large swathes of green infrastructure to protect cities from sea level rise, like the Big U in Manhattan, which actually we saw some of the ideas of it in a video earlier in the show, in the course. What I'm going to do now is go to the bulletin board to make you mindful of the fact that what we're doing now is discussion. And I've had one or two people put stuff on there. Here's the same statement written again. And I have 3 people who've put in a statement at this point. But what I'm looking at is just kind of a general response. And this is something I wrote some time ago, but it seems apt in this general discussion. We passed 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The world is hotter, the seas are rising, the forests are burning, the soil is unstable, and many of us are at risk now with the COVID-19. Environmental threats, regional warfare, disaster refugees, how do we try to find our way? Here is a wonderful inspiration, our place in nature, to drive creative thinking around, about, in support of a way forward, a fix on a location at what appears to be a turning point on our journey in this frail, confusing planet, an attempt to fix navigational points and to move forward mindful of our peril, with purpose, with trust in the future. But I am digressing, writing without subject, verbs, objects, but the whole idea is that we need to have a plan to do something, but what to do? We should pull together the research of right-thinking, logical folks, but then we also need to experiment to find out what works, to convince people to work together for our common good, to craft a logical, tenuous, always changing approach to open ourselves to change, leave room for the human spirit, and always seek solutions that offer multiple advantages, no more linear thinking. This is, I think, what's gotten us in trouble, and the challenge we face today is to try to find this kind of integrative approach. I can think of no two fields that are more apt to talk about in this regard than economic development planning and transportation planning. Going back to mixture of a couple of PowerPoints that I presented, some of which I've presented before, but I'm trying to do it now with a little bit more focus. All right, get back to this. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to have to go back to the front of this one. Entered in the middle of it. My bad. Sorry about that. Anyway, here we go. Transportation planning. And this is repeating a few of the things, but let's talk about it in terms of what Katie has to say. There are really quite a few issues delivering public transit in the US today, mostly because the cars are already there and make it very difficult for us to create any other of the more traditional kinds of transportation systems that we really, in some levels, really look for, hanker for, the kind of transit systems of another age. But together with autos and suburbanization, they've dispersed the population to make it very difficult. The cost of rebuilding an entirely new infrastructure while also maintaining the existing one, of course, is prohibitive. But we're looking at a major infrastructure bill at this point, and maybe now's the time to start talking about some of these ideas of how do we basically rebuild our infrastructure effectively. So we're left with cars. They're supposedly self-financed and they're paid for by the individual when he pays his road taxes, insurance, and the cost of his car. But what we know already is that it really doesn't. Just like the rapid transit, the amount of money that it takes to actually build a highway has to come from the federal government. Essentially, it's not self-sustaining. The amount for maintenance on a typical freeway is about $1 million every quarter mile per year. And those figures are actually from the 1980s, the last time I got involved in a project there. So it's not self-sustaining highways in any case. And so the comparison of the two is problematic just because of the way we've organized how we pay for it. When we look at the metropolitan planning, what we see is this, 4-step method, which is based on the science of flow, fluid dynamics. And what we're really looking at here is a way to take roads, which are what connects people together, and trying to turn it into the science of cars. We have the established the trip generation, then figure out how it's going to be distributed, and then what are we going to use to get around, walking, biking, cars, buses, whatever, and then figure out how we will divide the trips up among the various routes, and then somehow or other come up with the notion of, this is how big we need to make the road. Well, this is a systems approach, transportation systems management, but what it doesn't really account for a lot of times is something called induced demand, where essentially you build it and they will come. We've seen this happen time and again. And it's really hard to break out of this. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the big drivers of it, because it is federal money, by and large, we're talking about, is this idea of OPM. How's that for another 3-letter acronym? Other people's money. And this essentially becomes very easy for people to spend and take credit for, even though it is really creating a problem on a national level. It's just expensive. And trying to look at alternatives like the bus mass transit or high-speed trains is problematic. The federal government has set up the UMTA, Urban Mass Transit Authority, that I allude to here, to try to deal with this for some time, but it's been spotty. By the way, Urban Mass Transit Authority helped to pay for the visitor center and bus shed and so forth in the city of Charleston. That was their attempt to try to integrate touristic trips with the bus and with the parking garage to try to create a node there. Arguably, it hasn't been quite as successful as people want, and now it's being revamped into something else. So here we go, always having to change. Cost-benefit analysis is frequently used to talk about the value of highways, usually basically dealing with construction and land costs, time savings for the individual commuter, and that translates into operating expenses for cars. But essentially, there's another issue, and that is just people's safety. And we really, that's kind of problematic to try to figure ahead of time. There are certain engineering rules about how you do things, which usually translate into making it even more prevalent just for cars. The idea here that has developed since the 1980s is, according to the Department of Transportation, there is a greater than one, if there is a greater than 1 in 1,000 chance that you might be killed, then they factor in $1 million expense in their planning. So go figure. Are we each worth $1 million? I don't know. It's kind of bizarre. But the cost benefit analysis is typically, not expressed in those terms, only after the fact when they're talking about making changes. So mass transit, on the other hand, requires a lot more different kind of, how shall I say, development than what we have. Suburbia doesn't lend itself. Really, we need densities of about 2,000 people to really deal with the kind of mass transit, trains, and so forth that we're talking about. And it needs to be controlled, needs to be supported by the kinds of activity, land use activity around the bus stops and so forth. So these basically become issues. Now, in the city of Charleston, what we've opted for, I think it's the next slide, is the paratransit, where essentially we're dealing with a less expensive infrastructure to try to create sort of a stepping stone on the way to another kind of transit, and work along some of the same principles, where we have this linear stretch of road with nodes periodically that allow people to create more dense development, more of a village atmosphere next to where they are stopping. And so that is the attempt. We've talked about that in class, and we realized that there are, a lot of issues there, but this is what's being put forward. And we can only hasten the day when they're talking about cross-axis. How do we get not only from North Charleston to Charleston, but how might we get to the surrounding areas as well? So here we are. By the way, one of the issues with the bendy bus, as some people call it, like in the UK, is that it is quite large. They've opted for the double bus that you see there in many cases, but they still have the bendy bus, and people object to it because of the size of it. It doesn't seem to fit some of the historic character areas in London. But, that's a question for all of us to ask here in Charleston too. So paratransit, bus rapid transit. So we really are dealing with trying to encourage people to develop transit, and we're doing it in baby steps. I guess the question is it going to be effective? Right now, the thought is that what we need to do is improve the image of riding on mass transit, and therefore other things will follow, kind of selling it, branding it. And so there's a lot of apps out now that work quite well. Those of you who've traveled into any big cities realize that there are bus apps that allow you to figure out when the next bus is coming, and what route you should most effectively take to get to your destination, how much time you're going to spend walking, and so forth. And in Europe, they're even more prevalent. They're able to integrate trains with driving and/or buses and/or walking. And they even allow you to do bicycles. So here we have the need perhaps to try to develop even further the kinds of apps that we are currently looking at. So what we're working on in the meantime, dealing with the cars, is a whole transportation system management that allows for toll roads, high occupancy vehicle roads, roads that allow you to drive faster if you pay money for it, the hot lanes, trying to deal with intelligent vehicles and fuel economy standards, all basically trying to, increase transportation. Also, even once you get out, they're looking at ways that you're not just walking anymore, but you're taking a Segway or one of the other alternative forms of transportation instead of just walking. Kind of interesting though. But the idea is that it needs to be on many levels, and we need to conceptualize it as such. I look at one place that has done I won't say a good job, but certainly a better job in trying to develop their transit systems, and looking at Toronto, where you're looking at not only, you can see the big green lines and the yellow lines in the middle of the map that are actually the high-speed trains, or not high-speed, but just trains, coupled with a bus system which gets out into the surrounding area in a much finer grain. And so the grid that you're looking at, the kind of red grid that you're looking at there, are the bus lanes to take everybody out into the various parts of the city. They're also in between there, not buses, what am I thinking of? Trams, that's right, trams that connect these things as well. So it just kind of depends on the current context, whether you're going from an outlying area into the main part of the city, you'd be taking a train. If you're inside the city, you'd be taking a tram. When you get close to your destination, then you'll be taking a bus. And that's kind of the idea, the kind of breakdown that they're using. And it's fun. Along with it comes a lot of ingenious use of, in this case, different kinds of transportation, but also land use and the idea of a more livable land use with different kinds of shops, sidewalk dining, various ways to try to make more efficient the process of using the car, all of it kind of showing up together. It's not ideal, but it does show the kind of way that we're all going. And Charleston is picking up on a lot of this too. So transit-oriented development, TOD is another acronym, basically exists on many levels. We have high-speed trains vision. I think we saw that in the last class, and you can see it again here if you like. We're talking about trains that go in excess of 200 miles an hour. The urban design and land use planning is central to transportation planning. That was the video I think we also saw of Kansas City. And what point that makes really is that, as I've said here, if you're going to do transportation planning, you also need to do land use planning. Do the two in isolation, or whether what you're really doing is opening it up for speculation, and you're not in control of what you're doing by any means. I don't mean just in control, but you're not going to have an outcome that really deals with congestion. And then there's the last one, which is kind of the use of pods in Indonesia. Essentially, that was actually suggested as a potential for the West Ashley during the West Ashley plan, and was considered for a while. Maybe it'll be possible in the future. It's one way to use the existing sort of highway system and suburban system with a smaller scale transit unit, I guess you could call it, pod, I think they refer to it as, to kind of get people around in their various areas. It sees some reduction in carbon footprint and in pollution, but not a tremendous amount. And so it's a question really about what our values are and what we want to build. There is a great argument if you're trying to keep the suburban system for using something like a pod. So these are different visions of transit, and ones that we all need to kind of think about as we are pursuing changes that are needed in Charleston, of course. And side by side with that, land use planning, right? I just talked about that. Well, land use planning is all about building the economy. And I would make a small difference here. There's a difference between economic development and economic development planning, economic growth, I should say, economic growth and economic development planning. Economic growth, jobs, who's to argue with that? The problem is many times short-term decisions are made and we have to live with it long-term. And so what makes sense as an immediate fix to increase the number of jobs may not actually make sense over a longer period of time. And that's where you have to consider policy level decisions in much more integrated fashion. Again, trying to get away from linear thinking into something much more comprehensive in order to try to wrap these things together. So economic development planning has always been problematic because it ties together a bunch of different fields of study, but also different areas, whole regional context in order to get highways to move. And so what we really are dealing with is, an attempt that we've been trying over many years. The first attempt they pointed out in the textbook was the Erie Canal. You have to also see the best friend in Charleston as a follow-on to the Erie Canal. In fact, that's what they were talking about when they were designing it and thinking about it, to try to develop new markets for the town, for the city, based on this other form of transportation. And so what we have is economic development planning sort of growing up, particularly after World War II. We started looking at areas where we had structural unemployment. In fact, they were calling it that even before World War II and during the Depression, where we had vast areas that were unemployed people were there. I mean, there were people who used to farm and the farms were no longer viable and they weren't trained to do the jobs that might actually be able to be put there. So, but after World War II, they did develop a more comprehensive strategy to try to deal with it with the TVA and others, and looked at trying to do a lot of retraining to try to get people involved in their local area. And so this gets translated down to the local governments where they take the subsidies coming from the federal government for training and for other kinds of, grants, and develop other kinds of mechanisms like loans, tax-exempt loans, and trying to kind of force the issue. One of the big things that the federal government helped to promote were these industrial parks, and you've seen a lot of them around, I'm sure. And they subsidize those rather heavily as kind of a quick and easy way for a city to set up shop and be able to say, okay, you private people come in, let's build a business, let's get jobs. Again, that would be job creation, not necessarily economic development planning, because it's not anything more than just that isolated little bit of land, and it's not talking about support services or how you're going to integrate that with anything else. It's a difference between suburbia and city, right? So we have to ask ourselves, was the federal government really well advised to do that? It certainly helped, like with the highways, to keep people in suburban areas. Also, whenever you have federal government or any kind of intervention, there's this concept of, no longer developing it according to the free market. There's a great little breakout in the text, in fact, that deals with economic development planning. I thought I would try to pull it out here. Does public intervention make sense? Does it make sense when we try to do this? Whether such federal subsidies to local governments make sense has been subject of considerable argument. This is on page 212, at least in my third edition. But basically the idea is that it may be good for short term, but not necessarily for long term. If it is the most efficient solution, then theoretically the free market system will, make it happen there. If it's just put there in order to create jobs, or as they say in the text, equity in the area to try to spread the jobs around, then it's basically a business that's being subsidized. And the question is, is it worth it? And so here we have the idea, they call it the efficiency equity trade-off. It's always a subject for discussion whenever we talk about economic development planning. And also, quite frankly, needs to be more of a part of the discussion, because a lot of times economic development schemes are for short term, not just economic benefit, for political benefit. You look at Nikki Haley and how she rode the development of the Boeing factory to higher office, essentially, claiming credit for it. When we look at the details of it, though, we might say, it's part of our place now for sure, but was it worth it? That's a question. So when we look at the federal government, that's kind of a big brush, and sometimes they create a lot of unintended consequences. When we look at state development efforts, we have a slightly more refined view, but still, what we're dealing with is the same kind of question about equity and efficiency. The techniques used are cutting taxes, reducing services, and redevelopment of right to work legislation in order to create a suitable sort of business environment. But then again, we're paying out a lot of money in subsidies. Mercedes-Benz in Vance, Alabama paid about $168,000 a job, which is interesting. BMW about $65,000 a job. Boeing, not sure. $900 million, not sure exactly how much they're going to get in terms of jobs out of it, but that comes out of the public purse. The video I show at the end was an earlier version where it was only 800 million. I think this is an updated count based on the News and Post and Courier. Anyway, state development efforts pursuing the same kind of goals as federal development, perhaps a little bit more focused, with a lot of the same efficiency, efficacy, equity, I should say, issues involved. So down at the local level, that's where a lot of it's starting to happen now. And what we're looking at whenever we do this is competing areas, winners and losers. A great example of economic development planning, believe it or not, is the placement of the Hunley. Whenever it was finally, I shall say, preserved, and trying to figure out where it's going to end up, there was a big competition between Mount Pleasant, North Charleston, and Charleston about, finding a suitable site for it there. In fact, North Charleston at the Navy base won because, they've located all their other facilities there, but also because they came up with a better financial package. Again, question, is it going to be worth it? I don't know. But this is an example of local development, sort of economic planning, trying to bring in new uses in order to create sort of a new economy. Or is it just an economy? Is it also trying to change the culture of a place? And this gets to some sort of intangible sort of aspects of economic development planning that's really kind of hard to parse out sometimes. Well, so anyway, local people try to do the same thing. It's supported by a more local tax base and tries to use what they can of federal money in this case. Research parks, like I said before, are a big part of that. Research and business parks are a big part of that. So local development planning is following suit with a lot of the same ideas. Trying to reduce unemployment and basically keep from having to reduce services. The question is whether or not, without raising taxes, you can really do that. So local communities try to do it by sales and promotion, by subsidization, reducing property taxes. Always in favor of that, right? Keeping small area finance arrangements, which are called the tax increment financing districts, the TIFs. We've talked about that in class a couple of times. Trying to find sites to make places available, develop actual buildings to put people in. So making sites available. In Boeing, it was the area around the airport. Okay, that was a regional commission that helped to develop that though. Incubator buildings, the cigar factory, right? Developing revolving loans to enable businesses to purchase and then use the money gained from those loans to purchase more properties to encourage business. That was certainly a very effective technique in Charleston, especially in the new developments going on the east side. And then use of land use controls and infrastructure, the zoning that we've talked about before, and where we put capital development planning, where we put water lines and roads and all the rest of it. So this is how local communities kind of try to make a difference on economic development planning. So these are the tools. And the question really is, as we're talking about revamping the infrastructure, to what extent can we take this engineering, how shall I say, formulaic view of roads and business and the rest of it, and translate that into a more multivalent kind of solution, one that allows people to get multiple benefits from it. Time and time and time again, whenever the Dutch were here over the summer, they pressed that point home very strongly. And this is a question that I think that is very timely for us right now. So I'll close out on a PBS news broadcast, which shows some of the issues that came up whenever Boeing was being put in place. And we'll ask ourselves, can we continue with the same kind of approach to, how shall I say, subsidizing big businesses here, or do we go to something more localized, more community-oriented, and perhaps more effective and more resilient in the long term? So let's have a look at what they say. If I can get it to click, there it is. All right, cool. Boeing, here we go.
I was raised to believe, despite where I came from,
I could literally be anything I wanted to be.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I got rid of the front part.
I was born and raised in Las Vegas.
Storytelling project, that could be pretty cool though. I've known a couple of people do it.
I love bringing other people together. I feel like I'm doing something important.
I had loving, supportive family members who pushed me to dream big.
PBS American Portrait. Share your story today.
All right, here we go.
Next, back in this country, a fight among government, labor, and business over the location of a manufacturing plant. Margaret Warner has our story.
The fight is over a case brought by the government's National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, an independent agency where Democrats currently hold the majority. At issue, a just opened $750 million Boeing factory in South Carolina, where the company plans to build some of its 787 Dreamliner passenger jets. The new lightweight planes are already being built at Boeing's main factory complex in the Seattle area, but after a series of union strikes in Washington state, the company decided to open its second 787 assembly line in North Charleston, South Carolina, a right-to-work state. In April, the NLRB charged Boeing with illegally retaliating against unionized workers. Hearings in the case began before an administrative law judge in Seattle this week. Separately, a Republican-led House committee held a hearing on all this in North Charleston today. And for more, we turn to Stephen Greenhouse of the New York Times. Stephen, thank you for joining us. Flesh out this complaint for us. What is the agency charging is illegal about Boeing putting this plant in South Carolina?
Nice to be here, Margaret. So the National Labor Relations Board is asserting that Boeing, in deciding to open this plant in South Carolina, is illegally retaliating against workers in Seattle because they had exercised what the Labor Board says was their federally protected right to strike. And the union up in Seattle has gone on strike 5 times since 1977, including a 58-day strike in 2008, which Boeing says cost the company $1.8 billion in losses. So when Boeing announced 2 years ago that it wanted to open up a new factory in South Carolina, some Boeing executives said, we're tired of all these disruptions. That's a major reason we're leaving. And the Labor Board said, you can't punish the workers in that way. That's illegal. You're retaliating against them for exercising their right to strike. Boeing says that's not quite right. Boeing insists that the main reason it's moving is for the lower labor costs in South Carolina. So there's a real difference about the reason why Boeing is moving the plant.
Now, companies, U.S. companies, have been moving plants south to right-to-work states for decades. Has a case like this ever been filed before?
Not quite like this, Margaret. There have been other cases where in the middle of a union contract, the company will say, we're going to close shop and move, and the NLRB will bring a lawsuit and say, you can't do that, that's retaliation, you're violating the contract. So the NLRB has moved against companies moving, that have moved plants to the south. I think the problem here is Boeing, according to the NLRB, Boeing was caught red-handed saying we're doing this to punish you for striking and to prevent you from striking again. And they say that's illegal, kind of suppression of workers' rights. And folks in South Carolina are outraged by that. They say, and Boeing is outraged, they say Boeing should have the right, like any company, to decide where it wants to locate a plant, and federal bureaucrats shouldn't get in the way.
Now, what is the union's role in all this? I noticed at the hearing this week in Seattle, the judge was urging Boeing and the union to settle.
Right. So the machinists brought the case to the National Labor Relations Board saying that all workers are being illegally retaliated against. They filed a complaint with the federal agency, and then that agency, the Labor Board, decided to move forward with a case saying that Boeing had acted illegally. So now the judge in Seattle, the administrative law judge in Seattle, who worries that this case is going to go on for weeks, even years, says, look, guys, you've got to really try to settle. And he's trying to forge a deal between the machinist union on one hand and Boeing on the other, and maybe Boeing would commit to build additional planes, maybe decide to locate a whole new line of aircraft manufacturing in Washington State, which would create and guarantee many, many jobs for unionized workers in Washington State.
Finally, briefly, what's the political dimension here? Big one.
This is, Margaret, this is blown up into political firestorm. There's this little thing, the presidential, Republican presidential primary coming up, and that will be in South Carolina, and the Republican candidates are climbing over each other to condemn the Obama administration and National Labor Relations Board for improperly discriminating against right-to-work states and southern states. And also, I think in South Carolina, there's a feeling that the federal bureaucrats, the socialists, the regulators, the pro-union forces are unfairly discriminating against, taking advantage of, trying to take jobs away from South Carolina. And South Carolina says, we just want to find jobs for our workers. Our unemployment rate is above the national average. This is a great thing. Having Boeing come is a great thing for South Carolina. It's the biggest single investment in the history of South Carolina, and they're just very, very upset.
So more to come. Stephen Greenhouse of the New York Times. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Nice to be here.
So anyway, back to this, I think. Maybe not. Okay. All right. So we now know that when we start dealing with economic development planning, we start talking about, let's see, is this me? No. Anyway, I won't try to fiddle with it anymore, sorry. We are really dealing with kind of a complicated societal issue that affects a lot of different things. That's why whenever we start talking about trying to find easy solutions to these complicated problems, it comes back on us. nevertheless, it's interesting to see the dimensions as they develop in real time, right? So right now, I'd like for you to take a look at Katie's comments, maybe even think a little bit about what we talked about in class today, and see if you can develop a response that gets us thinking. Now, Grayson, I've seen, has already developed a thought based on her perspective from the Preservation Society, and that's very interesting. There are other perspectives which I'm sure you can bring into it, and I would encourage you to do so. So, can we develop a way in this situation to create jobs, be mindful of the future, at the same time we try to take care of the sort of emergency that we're in? Those are two things we have to balance together. And so here we are at a really important time in our lives, and how we're going to go with it. Appreciate your comments. Look forward to seeing them.